Hi, greetings. I'm Doug Bell. I'm Ernst & Young's Global Trade Policy Leader, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. We'll be talking today about the 2020 U.S. election results and the impact on Korean businesses. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We'll structure the discussion along the following lines. We'll start off with a brief description of the political analysis and assessment of where we are right now, which is relevant to the policy conversation. We'll also discuss what the range of issues are and those that are impacting business, with special emphasis on cross-border trade. And then lastly, we'll spend a little bit of time on sector impacts. So what should you be able to take away from today's discussion? First, you should be able to understand key developments that will impact trade and economic policies under the Biden administration. And two, gain insights into specific issues and what's to be expected. And importantly, where we have some degree of certainty that might around those issues and where there's a degree of uncertainty under a new administration. So let's get started with a bit of a political analysis. So there's key messages for the global business community. First and foremost is this election will most likely usher in more modest policy changes, certainly less than what had been discussed during the campaign. And a big factor in this is whether or not Democrats gain control of the Senate. And we'll talk a little bit about that under those political developments. We would expect this policy continuity on tax policies, U.S.-China relations, industrial policies, and by that I mean the emphasis in U.S. policy around reshoring manufacturing and areas like government procurement, and antitrust, particularly around technology companies. But here's a catch. How the Biden administration will approach these particular policies, even if directionally they're moving in the same direction, will be different. So there'll be less decision-making from more centralized decision-making that we saw under the Trump presidency, and more of an effort to bring in together broader interagency expertise in the bureaucracy. And this is expected to lead to more predictability and less uncertainty. And this also extends to coordination with allies and multilateral institutions. And thus, we would expect a degree, what I would describe as more deliberate policymaking. So even while maybe there's a similar assessment of U.S.-China relations, for example, how those relationships are dealt with will be materially different. The approach will be different, even if directionally it's moving in the same space. And there will be differences. One of those, of course, will be trade policy, where the president has a great deal of and we'll be looking to see how disputes are resolved with allies and others, and as well as reassessing sort of the role that national security has played in these discussions. And then, of course, climate change, which is a big emphasis for the Biden administration. And we would expect to see re-regulation in the energy sector and emissions generally. And then, of course, there's the Paris Agreement and the desire to rejoin that. So let's talk about the politics and why is there a difference. So as most of you should know, there is a still unresolved set of Senate races in Georgia that will determine who controls the U.S. Senate. And so as I go through this analysis, we'll talk to you about an environment where there is a Biden presidency with a split Congress, so no majority government, or where there's a Congress for full Democratic control. It does make a difference, and even where the Democrats have control, they'll have such a narrow margin that will limit their ability to pursue a more aggressive set of policies. So in terms of the presidential election itself, obviously the United States will have a formal president-elect on December 14th. Until then, we have the outcomes of the state elections and results that the AP has identified. So we still have to wait for that December 14th, but this is the direction that we expect to travel. So let's discuss a Biden administration. So the first thing I want to do is outline for you sort of what we consider to be the top business risks. And again, looking at this bifurcation between a Biden presidency, split commerce and full Democratic control. And what you can see on the graph that I've sharing with you is we've identified a number of risks. So first and foremost is the pandemic and economic stimulus package, corporate tax changes, continued U.S.-China tensions, trade policy uncertainty, and so on. And basically tried to position those in terms of their potential impact and likelihood under these two scenarios. And I think you can see that probably the most significant one is probably on the tax side, where lack of control of the Senate makes it very difficult to do much. And even if they do have, they certainly will have a difficult time meeting the sort of aggressive targets that they laid out in the campaign. And then the other area is really on climate change, which I identified earlier. So let's jump into some of the specific issues. I mentioned first and foremost tax policy. So here again, we don't expect to see major changes. I think as I made clear discussing the political environment, it really does come down to the control of the Senate. If Democrats had a larger margin, it would definitely be possible to see more extensive impacts. But by and large, if there are changes, they're expected to be much more modest under any circumstances. So that is one that is obviously probably the most significant impact on corporate and businesses. And we expect to, as I mentioned, to see sort of more modest changes. So I'd like to spend some time and go a little bit more depth on trade policy. And here, as I mentioned earlier, this is an area where any president has a great deal of control, as we've seen over the last 4 years, and policies have been pursued under President Trump. We do expect to see differences. By and large, the President Biden and candidate Biden has expressed a lack of interest, or doesn't view tariffs in the same way, or as a tool to be used in the same way as President Trump did. And we would expect to see a greater adherence to trade rules, an effort to improve and reform the WTO, and really try to resolve some of the existing trade tensions that exist between the U.S. And its trade partners, and do that in a way that is not as direct. Now, the most, probably the biggest one of those that we've seen is how the U.S. and China work together. And there, that is one, as I mentioned earlier, where we expect to see a sort of a continuation. And by that I mean, it seems clear that the Biden administration shares sort of the assessment, and this is something that Republicans and Democrats, so including their parties, that China is a competitive rival with the United States, and as such, the U.S. needs to respond, and trade is part of that. Now, that has been a full court effort by the U.S. government, so it's not only tariffs, which we're all familiar with, but it's things like export controls, investment screening. And the expectation is that particularly for those tools, and particularly around technology, that the general direction of U.S. policy will continue. Again, how that is approached will be different, and it's expected to probably be less acrimonious, but the same issues that concern, or many of the same issues that concern the Trump administration, continue to concern the Biden administration. So we would expect that there will be a period where the new administration comes in. We'll have to reassess the existing policy, the existing that it's inherited, including 301 tariffs, and this goes beyond China to also include 232 on steel and aluminum, and other pending cases. And that as that sort of reassessment, which will take some time, then decide to how to move forward. The distinction I would make here is that going forward, new initiatives will be more consistent with historical approach to U.S. trade policy. So we would not expect to see 301, 232 being used in the same way. The real kind of question and where there's a degree of uncertainty is how will a new Biden administration treat its inheritance from a Trump administration. So how will it deal with China tariffs? How will it deal with the Phase 1 agreement? How will it deal with the 232? And this will be this will create some challenges because on one hand, as I mentioned, there's a desire to work more closely with allies when dealing with China, for example, to work with other countries. At the same time, these are countries, Korea is a good example, where 232 steel and aluminum tariffs have been applied. So that's a sort of a push to sort of remove those. On the other hand, President Biden will have his own domestic political challenges. There are stakeholders, including constituencies, that want to, in some instances, want to see these tariffs retained. So there'll need to be sort of a process to go through and decide which tariffs either make sense, what could be removed, but it will be a process and it will take some time. And the other additional factor, particularly around China, is that one would expect some sort of negotiation. Certainly China has tariffs on the United States. So unilateral tariff reductions or removals are probably not in the cards. More likely is a negotiation with China. And in that case, that'll take some time and continue to be additional tax on what's coming into the United States. So just a couple other quick questions. We always hear a lot of what we expect to see happen with the Phase 1 agreement. A little unclear. Clearly, whatever sort of new accommodation or new sort of arrangement that is reached with China includes addressing Phase 1, but also more importantly, issues that were in Phase 2, which were really more substantive structural differences between the United States. So in that regard, we expect to see that moving forward. The other piece that I would like to discuss very briefly is the role of currency, which has been introduced over the last 6 months by the Trump administration, either through countervailing duties or anti-dumping, or most recently in a 301 case vis-a-vis Vietnam. And this is around the valuation of Vietnam's currency and whether they were manipulating it or not. This is another area where, on one hand, those are controversial. Those will have to be reassessed. But there certainly have been voices in the United States that does believe that there have been currency manipulations in the past, and that the U.S. has been hurt by those. So again, a little unclear how the new administration is going to deal with that. They will have to deal with it, and figure out whether or not that those are really the right kinds of initiatives, or whether there should be some effort to reposition and go. A couple of other trade-related issues that we're mentioning: WTO. We do expect the administration to be more constructive in working towards reform and engaged. It's probably very likely that the Director General contest will move forward under a new administration. And so again, sort of this recommitment, a desire to demonstrate U.S. leadership to work with countries to develop it. I know while we're talking about specific impact around Korean firms, but it is just worth mentioning just about the EU. And because on one hand, I think another area where the U.S. will look to resolve its trade disputes, particularly around Boeing and Airbus. But there are trends within the EU, particularly around sort of their open strategic autonomy and what that means for digital, what that means for competition. There are potential tension points that will have to be managed between the U.S. and the EU. So again, that will impact the global environment, including how things move Korean firms. The last piece that I'd like to sort of cover is sort of around, do we think that there will be a U.S. economic and trade strategy? So the example that's used is, will the U.S. return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what is now called the CPTPP? And there, it's, the signals have been a little bit mixed. There's been no expressed desire to rejoin the TPP. But having said that, the U.S. will need to develop a more active, energetic trade strategy in Asia. And so it's very possible that the TPP may be sort of a starting point, at least in terms of how it was structured and provisions, and perhaps looking at individual elements of the agreement rather than the agreement as a whole, but as sort of a pathway to increase U.S. engagement. And this will be important for Korea because as the U.S. in particular seeks to redefine its relationship with China to work more closely with allies, obviously that becomes a potential issue for Korea and how it partners with the United States or how it also works its own particular relationships with China. And that has an implication particularly for technology companies. So think of the semiconductor industry, where we've already seen measures taken that apply to U.S. firms, and question of whether or not there'd be an interest in extending some of those measures to other countries as well. So this is an area that needs to be watched very closely because it does have implications. So let's move on to some of the other areas where, that I'm highlighting. So we talked about climate policies, and again, there are a lot of ambitions. The infrastructure build out $2 trillion. It's very hard to see, even under a democratically controlled Congress, whether they'd be able to do that. So, like some of these other areas, we would expect to see more of the climate change policies taking place in manifest themselves in regulations and measures that the president can take on his own without congressional legislation. But this will rank very high, and there'll certainly be an effort to think about how more rigorous climate changes, climate-related policies can be incorporated in trade and other areas like that. It really is a top priority for the administration. I also want to discuss very briefly industrial and strategies, government procurement, CFIUS. Those are all areas that will continue to be a strong focus for the U.S. government, with implications for investment in the United States, less so targeted at countries like allies like Japan or Korea, but certainly with a focus on China. Antitrust, again, that's a very much specific to the technology sector at this point, but it'll be interesting to see if that gets extended to areas like agriculture or health sciences, where there's been discussions. And so we do want to keep our eyes on that as well. And then, of course, multilateral institutions. I've sort of spoken to this, but this just highlights the increased role that the U.S. as it seeks to sort of reassert its historical leadership. It'll be interesting to see how that develops, of course, because the world has moved on and other countries will have their perspectives, but there will be a desire to reinvigorate these institutions and find a way to make them more effective in the current environment. And then lastly, immigration. This is an area where, particularly around H-1Bs, probably see some differences moving from sort of the sort of level of hostility from the Trump administration around that program to something that will be more managed and provide more opportunities to again, where there are economic justifications to move forward. So the key message here, and these slides we provided to you, is these are sector-dependent policies and need to be examined. These are just some very broad definitions, but to give you some sense of where there's policy continuity, a split Congress, and the devil's in the details that we don't really have time to do in this presentation, but certainly are worth spending more time on it. Further consultations as necessary. So I want to conclude on that note, and just to say that while trade is not expected to be at the forefront in the first 100-day efforts by the administration, it still will be important. It's still an important area where the president has a great deal of control and will be used to support either objectives in the climate space, this efforts around shoring. But again, those policies are expected to be more deliberate, have more consultation, and including not only with allies, but also with the business community. And at that point, I think I will conclude this discussion, and thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to continued engagement with GITA. Thank you. Bye-bye.